On the early morning of August 1st, 1943, thick blacks, smoke-piercing orange flames, intertwined in the skies over Romania. A B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber named Hells Wench, resembling a shooting star trailing a tail of fire, was tearing through the air at an ultra-low altitude. Inside the cockpit, tongues of fire greedily devoured the fragile fuselage structure, and leaking aviation fuel transformed the entire aircraft into a flying inferno. At this very moment, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, the pilot in command, faced an unimaginably cruel life and death decision. Through the smoke-blackened windows, he could clearly see a wide, flat expanse of fields below. If he chose to crash land, or if he violently pulled back on the yoke to gain enough altitude, the 10 brothers aboard his plane could immediately parachute to survival, preserving their lives in enemy territory. However, the moment he made that choice, the 17 bombers closely following his lead would instantly lose their guide in their suppressing fire. The entire attack formation would completely collapse, and this top-secret mission, designed to sever Nazi Germany, fuel lifeline, would plunge into the abyss with absolute failure. Life and death, personal survival versus the greater good, violently collided in a fraction of a second. Lieutenant Colonel Baker's hands gripped the scorching control yoke with a deathly tightness. He did not choose to crash land, nor did he choose to bail out and retreat. Instead, he locked the nose of his aircraft dead ahead into the deadly net of anti-aircraft fire, steering this burning behemoth directly toward the target. This military operation, codenamed Tidal Wave, was so audacious and insane that it remains practically unparalleled in the entire history of human warfare. The target was the Ploiesti oil refineries nestled deep within the heartland of Romania. This was absolutely not just an ordinary industrial facility, it was Adolf Hitler vital gas station, continuously fueling the Nazi war machine with a staggering 30% of its total petroleum supply. The Allied high command knew all too well that if they could destroy this energy heart, they would deal a devastating, crippling blow to Nazi Germany. But to annihilate this place was no easy feat. Ploiesti had been transformed by the German Luftwaffendanti aircraft artillery units into one of the most heavily fortified bastions in all of Europe. Previous high-altitude bombing attempts had not only suffered from abysmal accuracy, but in the face of the dense German anti-aircraft fire network were little more than suicide runs. Consequently, the Allies devised an extremely risky, arguably catastrophic tactic, an ultra-low-level penetration attack. This meant that the massive lumbering fleet of B-24 heavy bombers had to fly at an altitude of 50 to 500 feet, a spine-chilling treetop level, for a grueling 2,400-mile round trip. This tactic was so perilous that during the early training phases, alone the 8th Air Force tragically lost 47 B-24s simply due to misjudgments during low-level flight. The intelligence departments even issued a despairing prediction: the operation was expected to suffer a staggering 50% casualty rate. This meant that half of the departing aircraft and personnel would never return. 90 planes and 900 crew members were expected to be wiped from existence. Among the 178 heavy bombers executing this near-suicide mission, Hells Wench stood out with particular prominence. Its pilot was the 36-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, commander of the U.S. Army Air Force's 93rd Bombardment Group of Cs, and veteran boasting 11 months of rich combat experience. Sitting beside him as the co-pilot was the 25-year-old Major John J. Jerstad. J. Jerstad's presence was in itself a profoundly moving story. As an operations officer, he had already successfully completed his required 25 combat missions a full 3 weeks earlier. He was entirely entitled to return home with honor, far away from the smoke and slaughter of war. Yet upon learning of the grandiose plans for Operation Tidal Wave, the young major resolutely forfeited his ticket home. He volunteered to step back into this deadly purgatory as Baker co-pilot. Alongside the two of them, Hells Wench carried navigator Harold Sweetman, bombardier John McCormick, flight engineer James Merritt, radio operator cease a leaf item for utterly fearless gunners. 10 vibrant souls had their destinies irrevocably bound to the singular bomber. Let us rewind the clock to 6:47 in the morning, that very morning. The roar of engines deafened the air over the Benghazi airfield in Libya. 178 B-24 bombers took to the skies in succession, forming a colossal armada that marched grandly toward its target. However, the trajectory of war is always fraught with unpredictable variables. Just 3 hours into the mission, a sudden catastrophe quietly struck. A B-24 bomber belonging to the lead navigation formation, the very aircraft responsible for guiding the entire fleet, suddenly lost power over the Mediterranean Sea. Like a massive chunk of scrap iron, it plunged into the churning waves, disintegrating upon impact and killing everyone on board. Even more fatally, this aircraft took the most critical lead navigator of the entire operation down with it. Because of strict radio silence protocols and complex security measures, the backup navigators simply did not know the complete intricate flight path. In its very early stages, this massive bomber fleet had been blinded. As the formation crossed the Greek coastline at 9,000 feet and then descended back to 500 feet to evade radar, while skimming over the rolling mountains of Yugoslavia, a lethal crisis was quietly closing in. At 9:05 in the morning, the fleet arrived at a critical navigation waypoint named Ploiesti. According to the original plan, all the bombers were supposed to turn east here and strike directly at the Ploiesti refineries. But a suffocating mistake occurred. The navigation group, having lost its chief navigator, became disoriented in the complex, low-altitude environment. Instead of turning toward Ploiesti, they made an erroneous turn to the southeast, heading directly toward the Romanian capital of Bucharest, located 30 miles southeast of their true target. At this life-and-death juncture that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission, strict radio discipline became a fatal shackle. Lieutenant Colonel Baker acutely sensed this disastrous navigational error. He knew full well that the lead group was taking over 100 heavy bombers far away from their objective. He desperately attempted to broadcast a warning over the radio, but received absolutely no response. Making matters infinitely worse, German radio jamming had fully kicked in, leaving nothing but the piercing static of interference in their headsets. Time was slipping away second by second, and the flawless attack formation of 94 bombers, originally designed for a synchronized strike, was on the verge of total collapse. Without a shred of hesitation, Baker forcefully banked the yoke of Hells Wench hard to the left. The massive fuselage carved a resolute arc through the air, decisively breaking away from the established flight formation. A lone aircraft, he turned his nose toward the true target, Ploiesti. Behind him, the 17 B-24 bombers of the 93rd Bomb Group maintained absolute faith in their commander, clinging tightly to Baker and breaking away from the erroneous course. Now the terrifying enemy firepower that was supposed to be absorbed and dispersed by nearly 100 bombers would be entirely unleashed upon these mere 18 aircraft. They were flying straight into a death trap, originally prepared for a fleet 5 times their size. At 9:17 in the morning, Hells Wench, flying at a terrifyingly low altitude of 470 feet, swept into the Ploiesti air defense identification zone like a vengeful ghost. Awaiting them was a landscape of absolute despair, a forest of steel. The sky was densely packed with over 300 barrage balloons from which hummed thick, heavy steel cables specifically designed to slice through the wings of low-flying warplanes. On the ground, 230 large-caliber anti-aircraft guns, lethal 88mm flak cannons, and dense clusters of heavy machine gun nests were locked and loaded. In the airspace above, 200 enemy fighters, including B-F-O-N-I-N-E-F, W-O-N-E-N, I-N-E-Z, R-O and Romanian I-I, I-I, I-G-H-T-O, N-E-H-T, O-N-E were circling like vultures waiting to strike. The towering smokestacks of the refineries were spewing thick black smoke, not only obscuring their vision, but looking as though the very gates of hell had been thrown wide open to welcome them. According to the tactical requirements, the bombers had to drop their payloads at the exact height of the refinery's smokestacks, utilizing time-delayed fuses to ensure the bombs could penetrate the robust concrete structures of the factories before detonating. Hells Wench wove through a torrential rain of bullets and shrapnel with only 3 miles left to the target. At this critical razor-thin moment of survival, an 88mm anti-aircraft shell violently exploded just 200 feet in front of the aircraft. Instantly, another shell struck with the force of a thunderbolt, scoring a direct hit on the right wing root of Hells Wench. Accompanied by the deafening shriek of tearing metal, the shell mercilessly pierced the fuel tanks. High-octane aviation, fuel instantly sprayed into the scorching hot engine nacelle, triggering a massive cataclysmic explosion. A blinding orange fireball accompanied by billowing black smoke rocketed into the sky. The aircraft shuddered violently. In the blink of an eye, Hells Wench was transformed into a blazing chariot of fire. They were only 1 mile away from the drop point. They had merely 60 seconds of flight time left. During these 60 seconds of pure hell, Baker and Jerstad faced a trial beyond the limits of human imagination. They had every option to crash land the aircraft in the open fields directly below them, or to desperately pull up and allow the crew to parachute to safety. They knew with agonizing clarity that 17 B-24 bombers were tucked in right behind them. If Hells Wench abandoned the mission, crash-landed, or deviated from the flight path, at this exact moment, the entire formation would scatter to the winds. Their brothers in arms would lose their point of reference and the mission would irreversibly cascade into failure. Engulfed in this desperate inferno, Lieutenant Colonel Baker gripped the controls with superhuman strength, keeping the burning nose of the bomberin flinkling locked onto the Astra Roman, a refinery ahead. The massive B-24, like a mad and flaming bull, violently rammed into the obstructing steel cables of the barrage balloons. The razor-sharp cables shrieked against the fuselage with a sound that would set teeth on edge. But Hells Wench forcibly snapped these lethal tethers, tearing a bloody, brutal path straight through the net of death. At the precise moment they passed over the target, the bomb bay doors roared open. 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs carrying the wrath of vengeance poured flawlessly into the core facilities of the refinery. It was only at this very moment, only after confirming that the payload had been successfully delivered and the mission accomplished, that Lieutenant Colonel Baker exhausted the last ounce of his strength to pull violently back on the yoke. He desperately tried to force the disintegrating aircraft to climb, fighting to buy his crew one final fleeting chance to bail out and survive. Hells Wench struggled upward in agonizing torment. However, the inferno had already fundamentally destroyed the aircraft's structural integrity, as the plane barely clawed its way to an altitude of 300 feet. The overwhelmed right wing let out a final despairing groan of structural failure and completely sheared off at the root. The completely unbalanced bomber instantly snapped into a violent left roll, flipping inverted belly to the sky and plummeted toward the earth. In a deafening earth-shattering explosion, Hells Wench slammed into the soil of Ploiesti. All 10 courageous crew members perished in the blast. There were no survivors. Long after the war ended, to honor their transcendent courage and their willingness to sacrifice absolutely everything for the greater good. The United States government posthumously awarded Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John J. Jerstad the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. They could have landed safely. They could have returned to the warm embrace of their families. Instead, they chose to transform their burning aircraft into the sharpest of spears, thrusting it directly into the heart of the enemy. This heroic, tragic epic, sealed within the long river of history, serves not only as a profound remembrance of the cruelties of war, but also as an eternal hymn to the most sublime spirit of sacrifice that humanity can unleash in its darkest, most desperate hours. If you want more historical breakdowns of humanity, most intense moments of sacrifice. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We will continue to bring you the most compelling story from the annals of military history. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.